The US and EU have targeted Russia's economy with a new set of sanctions. Washington accuses Moscow of being reluctant to help end the violence in Ukraine. Details here with RT correspondent Gayane Chichikan.
The previous round of U.S. sanctions targeted certain Russian banks. More were added to that list. Their punishment is that they will not be able to borrow from the U.S. for longer than 90 days.
Today, and building on the measures we announced 2 weeks ago, the United States is imposing new sanctions in key sectors of the Russian economy: energy, arms, and finance. We're blocking the exports of specific goods and technologies to the Russian energy sector. We're expanding our sanctions to more Russian banks and defense companies. And we're formally suspending credit that encourages exports to Russia and financing for economic development projects in Russia. And because we're closely coordinating our actions with Europe, the sanctions we're announcing today will have an even bigger bite.
President Obama was asked if this ratcheting up of tension could effectively mean the beginning of a new Cold War. He disagreed. He said he does not see another Cold War coming. But that's not the way many people see it. There was a hearing in the U.S. Congress several hours before the president's announcement where you could hear the usual voices calling for increasing tensions and pressure on Russia. And then there was this one congressman, the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, who offered a different perspective.
You know, after the Soviet Union fell, there was a tremendous potential to making Russia our friend, a tremendous potential. They withdrew their troops from Eastern Europe. The Russians were open to all kinds of interacting and becoming part of the world community, and a tremendous opportunity, I should say, was squandered.
In the last few weeks, we've seen issues pop up one after another, not even related to the crisis in Ukraine. The U.S. has just announced its conclusion that Russia violated an arms control treaty from 1987. American officials say Russia tested cruise missiles as early as 2008.
There was a test firing of such a missile, but the United States agreed upon this. And therefore, we have to raise the question to the U.S. president. Why is he blaming Russia now with these things?
So this accusation has been years in the making, but U.S. officials chose to formally announce this accusation now when the tension between Moscow and Washington is already high. On the other side of the Atlantic, the UK government announced an inquiry into the death of Alexander Litvinenko. He was poisoned in 2006 in London. Whether or not that case will ever be closed, Russia will be in the headlines for weeks to come related to a murder case. Then in the Netherlands, the International Arbitration Court has ruled in favor of the shareholders of the defunct Yukos oil company and ordered Russia to pay about $50 billion in damages. That lawsuit was 10 years old. Now, officials in all these countries say the decisions had nothing to do with the current tense political environment, but the events did raise a lot of questions about timing.
All right, let's have a look at the companies hit by the latest round of America's sanctions. VTB is Russia's financial behemoth. It's the country's second largest bank. It also operates in the EU, Asia and Africa. Its subsidiary, the Bank of Moscow, was also included in Washington's penalties. Another target is Russia's agricultural bank, which is completely dependent on the government. Now, these financial institutions will be cut off from seeking medium and long-term loans from U.S. capital markets. Also affected the United Shipbuilding Corporation that manufactures both military and civilian vessels exporting to 20 countries. But economist Max Wolf, he says US-owned firms may have a tough time having to obey the new penalties.
It's a little bit hard to nail down exactly, but there will be serious potential public relations as well as regulatory fallout. So I do think you're going to see folks make a good faith effort to first understand what exactly this means, and then two, very quickly, especially given, again, the really short time frame here, quickly be compliant with what they think exactly this means as it becomes hopefully more clear in the days ahead.
This time, the EU backed up the US sanctions. European leaders agreed to target several sectors of Russia's economy, including finance and energy. I talked about it earlier in the program with RT's Peter Oliver.
EU leaders have put forward sweeping sanctions against Russia. In a joint statement, the President of the European Council, Herman Van Rompuy, and the head of the European Commission, José Manuel Barroso, said that these sanctions were intended to send a strong warning to Russia. Whereas previously sanctions imposed by the EU had targeted individuals or one particular company, these are targeting huge sectors of the Russian economy. So what they are looking at is energy, where Russia will have restricted access to technologies. In the financial sector, it will be blocking Russian access to EU funds that are available. And in defence, an arms embargo banning both the import and export of weapons into or out of Russia. However, any previously existing contracts won't be affected by that. Now, the United Kingdom has announced that it wants to push ahead with even further stronger sanctions against Russia. But what we are expecting is later on Wednesday to hear the full wording of the sanctions agreed on by all the EU heads of government. And these sanctions are expected to come into effect on the 1st of August and will be reviewed after 3 months, whereby they can be scrapped or continued depending on what the European leaders decide.
And analysts predict that Berlin will lose up to €6 billion worth of exports to Russia. In fact, trade between the two countries reached €76 billion just last year. And around 6,000 German firms are doing business in Russia right now. What does that mean? Well, hundreds of thousands of jobs are potentially dependent on the economic ties between the nations. Economist Michael Mroz told us that many in Germany are wary of the damage the sanctions will cause.
When you talk to the people on the street, when you talk to people who have run a business or are executives in a big company, they are not for this sanctions. I can tell this to you, because sanctions never are a one-way street. You have always a reaction to a sanction. And when it comes to this imposed sanctions, or the sanctions that will be imposed on Russia, then of course the Germans are the ones who are suffering most. It's easy for the United States to shout for sanctions, but the ones who are suffering are the Germans or those countries who are close to Russia, because they naturally have the biggest business implications.